run Green Drinks Manchester. We've teamed up with Greater Manchester Climate Action Network to put on a workshop tonight, which is going to look at carbon jargon, which is a catchy phrase, basically to summarise everything which is used by academics, by governments to communicate climate change in a way that people are supposed to understand, although sometimes, if you're like me, it gets a bit confusing. Maybe that's on purpose, but maybe we'll get into that one. So yeah, anything to do with budget, carbon budget, zero carbon, absolute zero carbon, all those kind of terms I'm sure we've heard about before. Right, come take a seat, we're just getting started now. So the way this evening is going to work, once I've shut my mouth, we're going to let Joe do all the talking, because he's more of the knowledge. He's going to tell you about, talking through carbon budgets, going to talk through any terms like that, and really we want to hear from you about what questions you have. If there's anything in particular which you have a question about, then we're really interested to lead the discussion in that direction, so feel free to pitch in as much as you would like. And then we're going to go into a little bit of a group discussion, because, hi, you're right, no, it's fine, take a seat. And then, of course, a workshop would be complete without some sticky notes and an A1 sheet of paper, so we're going to do a bit of that, do some sticky notes and all that kind of stuff. And then we're going to see about, and obviously what we talk about will depend on how we want to lead the discussion. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Joe, who's going to run us through the initial bit of the PowerPoint. Okay?
Cheers, thank you very much. So you kind of set me up a bit there, Tudor. You said I'm the one with all the knowledge. I feel that the onus is slightly on me. I mean, my hope for this is, you all come to this with your individual knowledge sets. I know a bit of stuff about carbon that I've done in the past few years. Hopefully we can couple them together and come out with something useful. So I think for me, the discussion is just as important as any other bits. I think we'll try and focus on that. Tudor's already run us through what we're going to do, but I think before I go into the kind of depths of the presentation, one of the things that I'd like to do, and Tudor and Mark wanted to do, was to get you to think about what you want out of this session. So I've put some slides together. I tend to talk around things quite loosely. So my idea is, if you want to have a chat with someone around you, work out what you want out of this session, what kind of carbon jargon you want busting. Hopefully, as I kind of go through, I can shape it to what you need and what your needs are, rather than what I think you might want to know. That seems a little bit more appropriate. My suggestion is maybe we spend the next 5-10 minutes having a chat with someone, preferably that we don't know, and thinking about what we want out of the session. Does that seem all right, reasonable? Okay. Brilliant. Thanks.
sugar.
No.
Oh, yeah.
Not for that. He's okay. He's got to have one of those So he's not looking forward to that.
Last week. Yeah, I'll send it to you. I just think
I am here, but yeah, don't worry.
Can we get moving on if you Brilliant. You're all so much more receptive than students talking about doing that.
I think you might need to.
I spoke too soon.
Do you want me to move that chair?
Okay.
It's actually all
Is there anyone
right.
what you want to get out of this session?
No.
No.
I think to understand something about carbon budgeting and how organisations might be able to take that forward,
Okay, thank you.
that would be useful.
Brilliant. So that was understanding something about carbon budgets and thinking about how organisations might be able to take that forward. Was there anything else that anyone wants to get at?
I'd like to understand how people who work in the area of like conservation or land acquisition and rewilding, how they would offer back to, not to broad and call them polluters, but like offer back to people the opportunity to take up carbon credits there, and how you would go about that. So
Okay,
I'm not sure if that's out of the remit of her, but
So that's something around the role of agriculture and how maybe they can get involved in carbon credits and
not
offsetting,
necessarily
maybe.
agriculture. This would be like acquisition of land
Okay.
for rewilding projects
Rewilding.
and reforestation or protection of already forested zones. And then I know about like the UN REDS program and different things, just like how they would go about offering that back or creating a market through carbon, and I suppose the moral issues of that as well. Actually, like because there's flip arguments about that. Some people agree with it, and a hell of a lot of people don't. So I suppose that's kind of demystifying that to a certain extent.
That's helpful. I've not touched on offsetting within the context of a 40-minute presentation, but
Yeah.
maybe at the end in the discussion
Sure.
that's something we
Yeah.
could get into, because I think maybe the debate about offsetting is probably a really important one that I've not touched on at all. I mentioned it slightly, and I'm slightly cynical about it, but we can
exactly.
maybe talk about
Exactly.
that. Talk about that
Definitely,
later.
yeah.
Is there anything else? Yes. Thanks.
I'd like two things. I'd like a ready application of CO2 levels to temperature. So that's the thing I'd like to walk out the door with if I can. The other thing is about people that dispute or deny the whole thing about carbon. I'd like to see some attempt to correct those denial strategies, I suppose.
Again, maybe I've set you all up a little bit too much here with a magic wish list of things. But I agree both of those things are important. In terms of correlating carbon and temperature increases, I talk a little bit about that. Probably the thing I'm going to show is actually it's quite a fuzzy picture, but they do correlate and go in the same direction. But thanks. Is there any last things that anyone wants to add to this list before we move on?
I didn't hear the first one, so apologies if it repeats it. But, for example, last week at the Low Carbon Homes Conference, Johnny Sadler, Manchester Council, had this wonderful metaphor of, in terms of Manchester City using its carbon allowance, it was like having your month's salary and spending it all by Wednesday of the first week, which is a lovely metaphor for it that people can really get their heads around. But I just feel a bit unsure about what are all the assumptions that sit into these projections and how secure are they? Not because I want to join Trump in rubbish, but because I think we all need to know how sure they are.
Yeah, no, I think that's again really, really helpful. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about is what I'm kind of calling the externalities of carbon footprints and carbon budgets, the kind of assumptions that are rolled into them, and the other things that have to happen if those budgets aren't to hold. So that's entirely what I'm going to cover. I think Johnny's suggestion of thinking in terms of it being like a budget for the month that you've got to spend, or you've got to ideally not spend it if you can. I think that's a really helpful one, and again, part of what I'm going to talk about. I'm conscious of time, unless there's an absolute... Go on,
Claire was next, actually. Do you want to ask your question?
I want to know, Joe, as we're hearing from the horse's mouth rather than the media prison, what are the things that you wish the media didn't get wrong that you're going to tell us that's the truth, if you see what I mean? Frustrations that you have with what's reported. Yeah,
Great.
so that's
No,
right.
That's helpful. The big things are zero carbon and any target dates.
Right.
Big two things for me, but we'll get into that. I'm conscious. I want to finish what I'm saying by 7, so that we can all talk together. I think that's probably more important. But thanks for that. Go on, sorry.
So, look, you might have touched this already. I just was interested in what the equity is behind working them out. So, how it's been worked out in terms of how much the West has already put carbon in the air.
Yes.
And what's the equity behind the carbon
Yeah.
budget? This is something I really want to.
This is absolutely one of those assumptions that we're going to tap into a little bit later. Thank you. Brilliant. Right, I'm going to move on. Carbon jargon Buster workshop. We know that much already. Probably a more interesting question. Who am I and why am I here? I'm a lecturer at the University of Manchester. I teach most generally on environmental governance and matters of sustainability. I'm a geographer, so I'm not a natural scientist. I'm not a mathematician. I'm interested in social sciences. I'm interested in politics. I'm from Greater Manchester. I was born in Droylsden, on Edge Lane between Droylsden and Clayton, so I'm local. I'm not just someone that's from the university that's coming in to Twitter at you. And my work for the past 4 years has been around this question of what counts, which I think is a really interesting question, right? You've got carbon accountants, people working on carbon budgets, mathematicians telling you what they should count. Also, I like this other meaning of the word count. What counts is that which matters. And that's really what I'm interested in here. So these debates about what we do count and what we don't count are central to what I'm going to talk about today. I'm speaking from experience. I was privileged enough that I could work with the CO2 monitoring group, courtesy of Ali, a few years ago. So I've done my own bits of accounting. I've largely worked on the question of aviation, most recently. So that's the kind of backdrop that I'm speaking from as we're going through this. So I'm going to deliver this talk in 2 parts, hopefully about 20 minutes each. In the first half, I'm going to talk about the idea of a carbon footprint. And in the second half, I'm going to talk about carbon budgets. The two ideas are intrinsically connected. We've got to take a footprint to be able to do a budget. I'm going to make 2 arguments. Yeah.
Really, just before we get into it, Joe, I think it's worth mentioning you've already shared slides with us.
Yes.
And we can make those available to everybody, so you don't have to scribble too much.
Yes, yeah.
Fear of not getting it down.
I have a terrible habit of changing my presentations at last minute. So what I will do is I will send the updated versions to Mark and Tudor, and they can send them around too. Yeah, so please don't scribble away. And apologies that this is so small. So second half, talking about carbon budgets, I'm going to make 2 arguments to you. The first argument I'm going to make is that there's not one right way of understanding our carbon footprint. The kind of metaphor I've got this is that a footprint doesn't look like a boot. We can never really get a perfect impression of what our carbon responsibility is. The second argument I'm going to make to you is that the most effective thing we can do, whether we're academics, activists or policymakers, is to focus on year-on-year emissions rather than end-year target dates. There's been such a big discussion about when Manchester, when the UK should go zero carbon. What I'm going to argue is that we should think about the total amount of carbon that we're emitting between now and the end of the century. That is probably the more important question. And the best thing we can do is to focus on year-on-year emissions. So the first half, carbon footprints. This is the example that I always draw on. This is a tiny picture up top next to the UK of some New Zealand land. I'm not privileging meat here, it's just that it's got the word New Zealand in the title. So of course the New Zealand lamb in the UK has come from New Zealand, and in our hypothetical example, the farm that the lamb was reared on was given investment by a US investor. Immediately we've got a really complicated picture. There's a huge question of who takes the responsibility for this New Zealand lamb. There is a massive amount of emissions associated with this, both in the rearing of the lamb, the energy that goes into powering the farm, feeding the lamb, the methane that the lamb releases, the transport of it to the UK, and the kind of emissions from the waste, from sewers, as it's digested. So a huge amount of carbon emissions. Who's responsible? Is it the investor? Is it New Zealand? Is it the UK? It's a really, really complicated picture. So when we're trying to take a carbon footprint of this, there's a huge question hanging over how we do it. I'm guessing that makes sense at this stage. So that's the one. How do we disentangle this mess? How do we say that one place should be responsible? I think it's worth kind of backtracking a little bit and thinking about the idea of carbon. Of course, our bodies are 18.5% carbon. Our homes are built on the back of carbon. Our transport, everything we eat, our bodies, all related to carbon. We can't really get away from it. So what are we really referring to? Most scientists tend to use the word carbon as a stand-in for greenhouse gases most generally. So when we're talking about carbon, we're typically talking about carbon dioxide and all the gases that heat up the atmosphere. The key point that I've just raised to you is that carbon is emitted at various different points in the production, consumption and disposal of goods. But equally, when we emit carbon, it disappears off into the atmosphere and doesn't really respect national boundaries at all, right? A piece of carbon, a bit of carbon emitted in Manchester might disappear off God knows where else, right? It's not, it doesn't respect these kind of boundaries. So how is it accounted in practice? Well, since 1996, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has told practitioners how they should count their carbon footprints. And this is the dominant way that we do it. In essence, what's counted is the emissions that occur directly within a territory's boundaries. So if you imagine Manchester and imagine all the emissions released there, it's all of the emissions that occur directly within that space. Mostly, people also count the emissions that are consequent from that territory's energy consumption too. And this is known as a territorial-based approach to carbon accounting. That's typically how it's done all over the world. But this isn't the only way that you could do it. There are alternative approaches. They're much more complicated to account for. But you might, for instance, consider a consumption-based approach, which is the emissions that are effectively embodied in the things we consume. So if you go back to that example of the New Zealand lamb, and you imagine the emissions from the rearing of the lamb, the transport of the lamb, that might all be allocated to Manchester. Equally, there's an approach called an income-based approach, also known as downstream emissions responsibility. In that case, you'd essentially follow the money. So in our lamb example, it would be the North American investor who was responsible for all of the emissions, including the emissions produced in the UK. So different ways of cutting that cake. The different angles on the same problem. But equally, I think they paint very, very different pictures, and I'm going to show you some of the consequences of that now. The article on the left is on the basis of a territorial-based approach. I've put production-based there, they're very similar, but I can get into the differences in a minute. The article on the right is on the basis of that consumption-based approach. So the one on the left says that emissions are falling, and the one on the right, of course, showing emissions are rising. Typically, when people talk about the carbon footprint, they don't make this distinction in terms of what they're counting. And I think this is problematic because we're not specific enough about what we're talking about. I think occasionally this is misleading to an awful lot of people. This is a slightly complicated diagram that's produced by Anno in Leeds. And this, again, is different perspectives on the UK's carbon footprint. So on the left, you've got that kind of territorial-based footprint, so those kind of direct emissions occurring within the UK. On the right, you've got a consumption-based footprint, and that is, of course, the things that we consume. And in the middle, you've got what's termed as a production-based footprint. Now that is a slightly different take on a territorial-based footprint. It includes some emissions from flying and also emissions from our overseas territories too. So a slightly different take on territorial emissions, but not too different. So each of these paints a completely different picture. And that's the kind of take on point here. I wanted to stick this in here too, because I think it's quite powerful. I spoke about consumption-based emissions, and we're going to get into the question as we move forwards a little bit of how we apportion emissions responsibility. How should a given territory or person assume responsibility for their emissions? What the graph shows is that pretty much half of all global carbon emissions, if you consider them under this consumption-based approach, are produced by the richest 10%. And I just think this is quite a powerful graph that illustrates that. So I talked a little bit about the national level, talked a little bit about kind of individual level as well, but I think it's important, given that I think most of us are probably focusing on cities, that we talk about cities too. Again, on this kind of consumption approach, this group called the C40, which is some of the 40 biggest cities across the world, some of the most richest cities, did a report on cities' footprints under this kind of consumption-based perspective. And they said that cities emit 60% more carbon under this approach than if you consider just their direct emissions, which I think is quite interesting. It's a slightly different picture. This is what is in the latest Manchester climate change report. It says that the city released 1.97 million tonnes of CO2 in 2018. The distinction I'd make here is that this is effectively a territorial-based footprint, but cities like to talk in terms of scopes. They break things up into scope 1, which is those emissions that are happening directly within a territory, and scope 2, the ones that are consequent from electricity and gas supply to the city. And this is the kind of diagram that's painted, where it's 31% the transport sector, I think it's 42% business, and the rest are domestic. But of course that is just in terms of direct emissions and the ones that are consequent from energy to the city. Way back in 2011, there was a piece of work done by Small World Consulting up in Lancaster, and this painted us a bit of an image of what the city's consumption-based footprint was. And I think this is still useful today. I've talked to quite a lot of people about this, and it's probably still a pretty good analogue for what the city's doing now. As you can see, the footprint by this perspective was around 3.5 times greater than its scope 1 and 2 footprint in 2008. You can see that, of course, lots of emissions from personal flights, that was around 11% back then. Emissions from shopping, from food and drink, household fuel. So it's a completely different way of breaking it down, but much more complicated to account for too. So as I say, I'll make sure these slides go around, but there's a lot of numbers and things you can dig down into that might be useful for whatever you're working on personally. Just to point out as well, there was a footprint report that was done at a Greater Manchester level. This is all GM scale, by the way. That might be of interest to you too. So that was looking at the emissions directly from food. So if anyone's interested in food, that might be worth looking as well. A question that I've been keen to ask, as Ali well knows, throughout my research, was why this hasn't been updated. I think if you talk to a lot of activists in the city, and probably me, they're all quite keen to know why the city hasn't updated its consumption-based footprint. And after about 3 years of trying to do bits of accounting to myself and from speaking to various different people, this is kind of what I've come down to. So these kind of consumption-based footprints are all based on these kind of trade tables, which measure trade in and out of a given place. So it's about procurement essentially, and the government produce these. The issue is they only produce them down to a scale that's regional. So we can say something meaningful at a northwest level, but it's a bit harder when we get down to cities. So when you're creating these kind of consumption-based footprints, they're a slightly fuzzy picture. And the big issue with them is that if you implemented them in Manchester and you were then to take actions on the basis of them, the subsequent year, it'd be really hard to distill what change that has caused for Manchester specifically. Again, because these tables are done at a northwest level. So it requires a little bit of creative accounting. With that said, I do think it's really vitally important. We shouldn't just be talking about stuff to do with direct emissions and emissions from energy. We need to be talking about consumption as well. So it might be useful taking a yardstick of this every now and then to kind of make sure action's going in the right direction. So I think this is something definitely worth pressing, maybe for a bit soon. One of the things that I've tried to work on in particular is aviation emissions. And this is one of the big things that people can't come to an agreement around. Obviously, if you get on a plane, it takes off from one place and it lands in another. How you divvy up those emissions is really quite a contentious issue. My approach to this, in conversation with Ali and some other people, has been to measure the emissions that take place from all flights that depart Manchester Airport. And I think this seems to be a fair approach. We treat it as something in and of itself that the city can have a handle in and impact. And the change is quite interesting. If you look at the flights to Europe, they've grown, this is that bottom bit at the bottom, the yellow bit, they've grown quite substantially over the past few years. The reassuring thing is that it's stayed steady in the past year, and we kind of want to keep it there. We don't want to go any higher. Finally, I mentioned income-based approaches. There's very little work done on this at all, so it's hard for me to say anything meaningful about emissions consequent of investment in Manchester. What I can do is stick a picture up of the protest outside of the Greater Manchester Pension Fund, and some of my own students now that have locked themselves in John Owen's building at the University of Manchester, protesting at the university's in continued investment in fossil fuel companies. So I think people are definitely taking action in this area. We can't really measure it because the numbers aren't there, the methodologies aren't there, but it's definitely something we should consider in parallel to these other approaches. So this is kind of my pitch to you. The carbon footprint doesn't look like a boot. It gives an impression of what our impact is, but it can't tell us absolutely everything about it. And different ways of footprinting tell us different things about the problem. So my kind of plea in relation to this is that we're really specific when we're talking about carbon footprints. We don't just say our carbon footprint is this, but our carbon footprint by this way of thinking is this. I think that's probably the important point to distill. And I think so many people are guilty of not giving that level of specificity, and I think that really, really matters. So yeah, this is my point. Different ways of footprinting are like different levers we can pull. Currently, I think we largely just think about stuff to do with direct emissions and energy. That's just like pulling one lever. We need to at least think in relation to these other levers to do with consumption and investment and aviation and transport beyond the city's boundary, and then we can pull all of the levers that we need to pull at once, rather than just one. So this is the second point, and I'm roughly to time, which is vaguely reassuring. So carbon budgets, that's kind of the tagline. And this is intrinsically related to the footprinting point from earlier. So what is a carbon budget? Well, carbon budgets, there was a really nice analogy before given in terms of, you've got your wage for the month, how do you spend it? Do you blow it all at the start of the month, or do you keep it and make it last a little bit longer? And that's entirely what they are. They're underpinned by this fact that global warming can be approximated by the carbon emissions released within a given period. Now, as carbon tends to hang around in the atmosphere, it doesn't just disappear after a year, it's important that we think about how that carbon builds up year on year. This is called cumulative emissions. Most scientists tend to use models that run from now to 2100. So they're typically concerned with this cumulative emissions that are released between now and the end of the century. So that's what matters. How big does that layer get of those cumulative emissions? Now the budgeting part of it is about deciding when we release that carbon and limiting that carbon to a set amount in order to limit warming. The easiest way of thinking about it, at least for me, is it's a bit like a carbon diet plan. It's about restricting when we're going to emit the carbon and how much we're going to use. Obviously we need it for our day-to-day lives, but how can we work sensibly with it to keep warming to a safe level? That's the general principle behind it. Of course, this is intrinsically related to this question of what a safe level of warming is. It was really interesting to dig back. We've all heard of 2 degrees. This was first proposed by the economist William Nordhaus. And when he suggested 2 degrees as this difference between safe and dangerous levels of warming, he said this. He said the process of setting standards is deeply unsatisfactory. The standards set here are just rough guesses, but this number has had such pertinence with us ever since, to the extent that